Hi. So today I'm going to try and take you on an excellent adventure through CSS Grid. I plan to show you some of the cool things you can do and also hopefully help you to avoid some of the pitfalls that could make it a bogus journey. But first, a really quick intro about me. So this is me. As you can tell, my special talent is not taking selfies. I like to choose moderately hideous wallpapers for all of my talk backgrounds. And I'm owned by this lot. And so you can tell they all get on brilliantly well. I have to show that to everyone. It's just something. So I live in Shropshire in the UK, which is not far from Birmingham, but it's still amazing that nobody's ever heard of it, ever. So I won't try and explain where in the UK it is. I work at HumanMade. We build enterprise-level WordPress sites. Officially, I'm a WordPress developer, but I mostly specialize in front-end development. You can find me on pretty much all the social media as @Kirsty Burgoine, so please do come say hello later. So, something you should know about me is I really love layout. Like, I love all of CSS, but layout is what really excites me most. And naff 80s films like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. If you've never heard of this film, then most of the references are going to be a bit lost. But thankfully, it doesn't tie in that well, because when I started to write the talk, I quickly realized that although this is an awesome naff 80s film, my main reason for choosing it was so that I could use these GIFs to describe CSS. And actually, there really isn't a lot of ways to compare CSS to this film. Before I really get into it, I just want to say there's a lot of code in these slides. I am not brave enough to do live coding yet. It will end up in a session of you watch me Google things because I've panicked on stage. But what I have done is created a CodePen collection where all of the examples that I showed today live, so you can have a poke around afterwards, and I'll also make sure my slides are available. But before I get to the code, I'm going to start by taking you back to a time and place before CSS Grid. It was a genuinely horrible place. It was where layout went to die. In the beginning, we had table layouts, which had so much HTML. We used spacer GIFs to move things around. It was all pretty horrific. From there, we made it even worse by introducing frames and then dumping all of our table layouts into those frames. But there was light at the end of the tunnel, and it was CSS. And for me, this came from reading Dan Cedarholm's book, which I didn't realize would have been published so long ago till I did this. This book taught me about learning CSS, how to use floats and display properties to create much more semantic, accessible, and SEO-friendly layouts with far less code. And it was a game changer. From there, I started looking at things like CSS Garden, and really learning how you can style things without needing to change the markup. Now more and more features have been added to CSS, browsers have moved on, even Internet Explorer 6 eventually was put to rest. Today we have CSS 3, and CSS 3 gives you a lot of layout options now. We have display block, display flex, and now also display grid, as well as a few others. Each of these has pretty good support. Display block has been around for a long time, so it understandably has 100% support in browsers. Display flex has 95.81%, and display grid has 91.89% in support in browsers now, which means by taking an approach of progressive enhancement, we can create flexible and scalable layouts across all devices and browsers, even if they're older. So let's start talking about what CSS Grid is all about. So I've done this talk a couple of times just as a practice at meetups. And I always say CSS Grid is the future, but every time I actually want to say grid is the word. But that's the wrong film reference and the wrong decade. And literally at the last meetup I did this at was my local JS meetup. Somebody came up to me and told me that I should have used the Tron film for the reference here because of the grid, which would have been really awesome, but it was way too late by then, so we're sticking with this theme. Anyway, back to CSS Grid. So MDM Web Docs defines it as A grid is an intersecting set of horizontal and vertical lines, one set defining columns and the other rows. Elements can be placed onto the grid within these columns and row lines. So this rather neatly sums it up. These intersecting lines create a two-dimensional grid system, which makes it the first true layout method to be introduced to CSS. It differs from other fake layout methods because they're all one-dimensional. So things like Flexbox, for example, will only allow you to control the row or the column. Grid gives us the ability to control both the row and column properties together. So let's start by creating implicit grid. So if we take this container with 5 items inside of it, apply display grid to it, and in this case also grid gap of 10 pixels, and you will automatically get a grid, which is pretty neat. This is what we call an implicit grid. We haven't defined any columns or rows yet, so the content defines them automatically for us. In this example, I have 5 grid items, so the grid is created and by default flows the content vertically down the page, creating 1 column and 5 rows. This is unlike Flexbox, where the default is to flow content horizontally. If we look at the grid tracks created, we can see the horizontal and vertical track lines that intersect to create the grid. And that's it. That's an implicit grid done, which is pretty easy. This would be a really boring talk, though, if that's all I was going to do with grid. Well, no, it's really cool. Implicit grids don't really give us that much control. In most scenarios, we're going to need to define a set number of columns and sometimes a number of rows too. And this is what we call an explicit grid. So if we go back to our original grid container, but define a number of columns by adding grid template columns to the CSS, we now get 2 columns that are 150 pixels wide each. So both grid template columns and grid template rows essentially tell the container what the grid should look like. Each column and row can be given an explicit value. In this example, we've given grid template columns 2 values of 150 pixels. We haven't defined any grid template rows yet. They're all being auto-placed. We can set the template rows as well, like this. So here we've set the middle row to be 100 pixels tall. This becomes really useful when you're trying to control the layout of individual components. Using grid template rows can become very handy. So we can also name the track lines as well. So track lines are the horizontal and vertical lines that intersect the grid. They're not the columns and rows themselves. So for example, this 2-column grid actually has 3 vertical track lines. Track lines are extremely useful for positioning content explicitly in the grid. By using the trackline names, we can easily set all odd columns to start at body start and end at column middle, and by using the shorthand of grid column start and grid column end. And the even columns can start at column middle and end at body end. We can also use this to span multiple columns. Here we've set the 5th item to start at body start and end at body end, which means it spans both columns. Naming track lines just really makes your CSS much more readable. It's easy to read. And you can give your track lines literally any name you want, although you probably want something a bit more meaningful than this. But you don't have to give your track lines names. We can place content by using the track line numbers as well. This is especially useful if you're working with large grids where it's unnecessarily time-consuming to name all of your track lines. You can, of course, also apply the same positioning to rows using grid row, and you could even take it a whole step further and combine the two for grid area, although I'm not going to do that today because you don't really need it for the examples I'm going to show you in a bit. The CSS Grid Specification also added some new units and functions as well, which are pretty neat. So the FR unit is probably the biggest, most important thing. It basically stands for fraction. It allows you to size your grid columns or rows according to a proportion of the available space in the grid. And this is super useful. So if we go back to our earlier example, where we set 2 columns at 150 pixels each, if we were expecting this grid to be a maximum of 300 pixels wide, This would actually be too wide, and you could end up with contents wider than the area you need. You could end up with horizontal scroll bars. It's all a bit ugly. And this is because of the grid gap. By adding that, the available space for the columns is actually 145 pixels, not 150. We could change the width of the columns to 50% instead, but that doesn't help us either. Again, the grid gap is getting in the way. We could get around this by doing some crazy calculations to subtract the grid gap amount from each column, or we can use the new FR unit instead. Now our grid columns take up an equal space each, but now there won't be any horizontal scroll bars at all because everything fits nicely. This is because the FR unit takes into account the grid gaps applied and then subtracts the correct amount from the overall space available, and then distributes that evenly across the columns. So repeat is a super handy little CSS function. Back to our example, we've used repeat 2 times instead of writing 1FR twice. And just for kicks, I've added in the template rows as well. Min-max is another really super little function. This one is the one that really allows us to create really dynamic, flexible layouts, but still have plenty of control over them. And what it does is, in this example, we can see that there should be 4 columns in total. 3 are set to 1FR, so distribute evenly with the space allowed. Column 3 is set to have a minimum value of 150 pixels and a maximum value of 1FR. And what happens is this. So we can see now that while all of the columns are wider than 150 pixels, they all fill the same amount of space equally. As column 3 has a minimum width set, when the browser window gets smaller and the columns reduce, column 3 stops reducing when it hits that 150 pixel mark, but the other 3 columns continue to get narrower until they collapse on themselves because we've not given them a minimum value. So that was a very quick whirlwind tour of some of the obvious concepts of grid, ones that I'm going to use in the next examples. There is a lot more I could show you, but that would be an entire talk on the 101 of grid. So let's start looking at putting this into practice. So in this section of the talk, I'm going to show you 2 different ways you could use CSS Grid in your next project. Each has its place and may not be perfect for every scenario, but also each shows the potential of what can be done and will hopefully inspire you all to go off and create some amazing layouts. And the first one of those is the no breakpoints approach. So as I said earlier, I'm a WordPress engineer, so I work with WordPress sites mostly. But even if the sites are not blogs, they nearly always have like a recommended reading, a latest post section, products for you, or something similar, which would maybe look something a little bit like this. So before Grid, this is something I would have used Flexbox to create the layout for. Before that, I would have used display block and floats. Either way, I would control the number per row by using breakpoints. But what if we don't need the breakpoints to achieve this? What if we had a way for our content to flow to best fit the space available? Well, with Grid, we can do this, and it's actually really simple. This is all you need. So here we've set it to display grid as before, and then made it an explicit grid by defining grid template columns. And this is where the magic happens. We've combined the repeat and the min-max CSS functions, but this time made use of an autofill value to repeat and autofill the columns instead. So it does that. As the row expands and collapses, if there isn't enough room for an additional column that's 200 pixels wide, the existing columns will fill the available space equally. And when enough room is created for a 200 pixel width column, it will add that column to the row. What's also nice about this particular example is when we think about progressive enhancement, we can create a default approach to this with only a few extra lines of code and add the cool fancy CSS Grid stuff only to the browsers that support it. So for this approach, I think like a minimum viable experience on IE11 would be to use Flexbox as the default layout because it is supported in IE11. There are some bugs still, but... So first I'll set that and give all the items within a margin of 10 pixels to create an equivalent of the grid gap, because sadly that isn't supported in IE11. I also at this point should note that Whenever I write any IE fallbacks, I feel the only way they work is if I also include sad face, trash can, and emojis in my code. I've then added my grid stuff by wrapping it in an it supports tag, so that if the browser supports grid, it will use this code instead. At supports is a neat little feature. It's not part of the CSS Grid specification, but it does allow us to do really cool things based on whether the browser can support it or not. Here, Flexbox doesn't provide the exact same experience. For example, the grid items wouldn't auto-flow and auto-fit the space available, but they would fall down onto the next line. So it's a good enough minimum experience. So hopefully you agree that that first example is pretty excellent. Even with the defaults for Flexbox, you've got far less code than if you had to control this with breakpoints. So the next example is what I call the no wrapper approach, or flexible gutters. So often when we want to control the width of the grid area, we will do something like this. We will create a wrapper, set max width on it, and center it horizontally. And this is great, it does what it needs. This is still a perfectly valid technique. In fact, I will use this in a later example as well. But let's have some fun and use grid to control the entirety of the page's layout. Now, when I say fun, obviously I think this is fun, you might be less so. So there looks like there's a lot going on in this example, but it's not anything I haven't already covered. What you can see is I've named specific grid tracks to define the start and end points of 3 key template areas on my page. There's a main content area and another column on each side to create the site's gutters. Visually, it would look something a bit like this. Here you can see how body start and container start define the left gutter area, container start and container end define the content container, and then container end and body end define our right gutter area. Then, by using the min-max function that we've used previously, as the browser window changes size, we have a content area that will never be narrower than 300 pixels and never wider than 1280, and a page gutter that will fill the available space but never get below 10 pixels wide. And it would look something like this. So the blue areas here show how the gutter collapses. So this is actually a very simple example so far. It gives us a content area and gutters without needing to use the wrapper div. But why is this useful? Well, there's lots of ways we could use this. So again, I said, I work with WordPress sites. One of the new things that's come in the last year or so is the Gutenberg editor, which now gives everyone the option as a content editor to click a little button to say whether they want that block to be full width of the screen or stay within the container. So this becomes a pretty common layout pattern. In the old days, to achieve this sort of thing, we would have had to use some clever trickery with negative margins and the VW unit to try and break out of the container or wrapper to create the full width content. But by applying grid to the entire page, we can instead use grid placement to place the content by using the first and last track lines that we named body start and body end. Using grid here gives us more than flexible gutters, though. It allows us to place content anywhere on the page and at any width, which is pretty cool. We could create more editorial style layouts like this one. So this isn't particularly complex magazine style layout, but I hope it gives you an idea of what can be done. If we revisit the grid layout we originally had, which looked like this, you should be able to see how this content was placed into such a simple grid layout to create something visually appealing. So there are a couple of small things that I actually changed in this, which if you're really interested, then please do go and check out the code pen, because it's all in there. But the only real difference between this and the original grid is that I've now also defined some template rows as well. So the code for the grid template started as this, but now it also has this added to define the rows. Again, we've defined 3 main content areas, but this time they consist of a total of 5 rows and all have a different FR value. So what's happening with the FR value? If you remember, the FR unit is a fraction. So on this page, we've actually got a total of 15 equal rows, equal parts. The first content area takes up 1 part. The second 3 rows take up 3 parts each, and the last one takes up 5 parts. And so that's how that divides across the rows. And if we look at Firefox DevTools, you can see the grid inspector shows you how that content's been distributed down the page as well as across. So hopefully you thought that was pretty cool. I certainly do. So, but the idea here is not to advocate that wrapper divs or breakpoints are bad, only that Grid gives us ways to control our content now across more devices and browsers without us having to rely on adding all of this extra markup or breakpoints. And this makes our code much more lightweight and easier to maintain as well. Now, I said I was going to show you 2 examples of techniques you can use in production. This last example that I want to show isn't one you can use in production yet. It does combine both of the previous examples, and it also uses both breakpoints and container div. Hopefully you will also think this is excellent. And this is Subgrid. So Subgrid isn't available for general use yet. You have to, if you want to play with it, you've got to use Firefox Nightly. But when it comes, it is going to change all of the rules again. It's pretty cool. So if we go back to the original no wrapper approach, but this time instead of only having 1 column in our main container area, we will combine the repeat function with the min-max function to give us 3 columns that each have no minimum width, but a maximum width of 400. Combined with the grid gap value we've applied, it gives us a container area of 1220 on desktop. So our grid layout would now look something like this. We still have our outer columns that create the gutter, collapsed down to a minimum size of 10 pixels. We also now have 3 columns within our container that we can place content into as well. So at the moment though, in order to place content items only in the 3 columns within our content area, we would have to do something like this. Which is not the smallest amount of CSS. So here we're using the trackline numbers rather than names to target the track lines within our container area, and then media queries to explicitly place the content in different positions at different breakpoints. On mobile, we're setting all grid items to span all 3 of the central columns, so there is 1 per row, and then on desktop they span 1 column each to display 3 grid items per row. And this is fine, and it works well. But if we think back to the first example I showed, we don't want to select all of the grid items and explicitly place them and then change that placing at different breakpoints. We want the content to flow to fit the space available. And this is where Subgrid can solve this for us. Firstly, we need to change our outer grid so that the columns in the container area are repeated with an autofill value, as we did with the first example, and combine that with our min-max function. Now we add a new container to the page for our grid items, place it so that it starts at container start and ends at container end, as we did before, and then apply display grid to it, so it's an explicit grid. But then for the grid template columns property, we will now apply a value of subgrid. And this will take the column settings from the parent grid instead of us having to define a parent grid and then define a child grid and nest that inside. So now we've added the subgrid stuff, we can create layouts that look a bit more like this. As we scroll down, we can see we have content that is the full width, and also standard content that fits within the container area, and a list of posts that will flow based on the screen size. So I haven't showed you all of the code that's used to create this particular page, because there's like positioning of the full width content and things like that. But I'm sure you'll all agree that by using this and this one, it's much less code than if you had to control all of that with breakpoints and add in the code to break things out of your container area. This is obviously only one example of Subgrid. There's a lot of stuff coming, and as of right now, we can only experiment in Firefox Nightly. But I think it shows how powerful it will be when it does ship. So hopefully this has been a pretty excellent adventure so far. Grid isn't perfect though, and there are a few gotchas that you need to be aware of to help avoid it becoming a bogus journey. The first thing to be aware of is content ordering. So content ordering isn't a new concept. It was first introduced by Flexbox. It can be extremely handy, but it should be used with caution. So looking at our early examples of a grid again, which look like this, what we could do here is rearrange the visual order of the grid items. And to do that, we would do that by targeting the individual items like this. So here, I've selected the third grid item using nth child. And then by applying an order to it, we can set it so it displays as the fifth item instead. We can also achieve this using grid placement, which I've shown you before. Here we've used the placement to set the fifth item to start at body start and end at body end, spanning both columns. But if we actually wanted that fifth item to display as the first, we would do that by making use of both the grid column and grid row properties and explicitly placing the item in the grid like this. So here you can see I've used the track names to place the content in the first column, and then because we've not given the rows names, for this example I've used the track numbers for the grid row to make sure the fifth item actually displays in the first column and the first row. This then forces all of the other grid items to auto-flow from the second position onwards, which is cool, but it's also got some negative consequences as well. It's because although the visual order has changed, the actual source order of your HTML has not, which means anybody that uses your site with the screen reader or keyboard or something will get some unexpected results. So if you were trying to keyboard tab through this, the tabbing position would start at 2, would go all the way down to 4, and then back up to the fifth one, which would create a jarring and negative experience for your users. So it's something to be very, very careful with. And that would, of course, be bogus. The next gotcha is always the elephant in the room when talking about CSS Grid. And actually, every time somebody asked me what I was talking about last night, it was the first thing they asked me. So definitely the elephant in the room. And that is Internet Explorer. So this is the thing that seems to put everybody off experimenting with CSS Grid. But there is some support for IE. And for the part of the spec that is not supported at all, there are other ways to create a minimum viable experience for older browsers. So Rachel Andrew, as I'm sure you all know, has written a lot of excellent articles about CSS Grid. But she wrote this one back in 2016 that outlines what parts of the specification are supported, what can be fixed automatically with auto-prefixer, and what can't. And it's really handy. But there are a few things that I come across time and again that I'll cover today. Probably the most common issue that seems to catch my colleagues out as well is around prefixing. So auto-prefixer is a really awesome tool, but it can't automatically prefix all of the things in CSS Grid. So looking at this code, we've created a simple grid containing 2 columns and 3 rows. In order for this to work in IE as well, we would need to add 3 new lines, and these are this. So there's an additional display property for MS Grid, and both grid template columns and grid template rows now also have an MS prefixed version. Also note how we've not used the repeat function on the MS Grid rows and grid columns. And that is because, although repeat is super useful, it's sadly not supported at all. So instead, this needs to be written out manually. And this is an area where auto-prefixer would catch us out, because while it can automatically replace the grid template columns and grid rows with the MS prefix, it can't update the use of the repeat function as well. Therefore, you would, if you had a 16-column grid, you would still have to manually write out the 16 1FRs. With these specific additions, we are part of the way towards getting our grid to work in IE. There is another key feature, though, that's not supported, and that is auto-placement. So this means that even though we have added these fallbacks to define the grid template, we still have to manually place all of the grid items within it. If we don't, then every grid item will display in column 1 and row 1, which is not ideal. And this is how we would do it. Now, I admit this looks hideous. And actually, it was an example of this code where the sad face, trash can, fire emojis that we now all use in work came from. But it shouldn't seem too unfamiliar, because we've already covered placing content in quite a lot of detail now. The difference here is that there is no shortcut to specify both the start and the end. Instead, MS Grid column replaces grid column start, and MS Grid column span replaces grid column end. And that is a lot of code, but if you use SAS and other things or less, it can be tidied up with mixing. This is just an example one. All this is doing is asking for the values for column start, column end, row start, and row end, and then applying it to all the MS prefixed versions as well as our grid column and grid row, so that when you actually have to write your CSS styles, all you need to do then is add that in, which obviously is a lot easier to read and certainly a lot neater. And like I said, this is only one example to beat the volume of code needed to support IE and speed up your development time. There are loads of different ways you could do this. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve. But in most cases, there's a correlation between where you need grid items to sit within the grid, where you can use your numbers to work that out. And of course, if that still doesn't work for you, you could use @supports, as I showed earlier, and use a different layout method as a default and only use grid where it has the proper support. Because when supporting the older browsers, the aim is not to provide exactly the same experience across all browsers and devices, but instead to allow the layouts to degrade nicely and ensure you provide a minimum viable experience. So supporting IE is bogus, but it's not quite as hideous as everybody thinks. So that's mostly CSS Grid. So just to wrap up, CSS Grid is really awesome. It's the first two-dimensional layout system introduced, which allows us to flow content based on the space available without a lot of extra code. We can control entire page layouts with far less CSS and HTML markup. It is supported by 91.89% of browsers. And Internet Explorer should not be the elephant in the room anymore. And of course, Subgrid will be even more awesome when it ships. So hopefully I've given you a whirlwind tour and inspired you to go off and create some amazing layouts of your own. The CSS Grid specification really does make it easier to change the way we think about flexible design and layouts. We're no longer constrained to specific pixel-perfect requirements. Our content can flow easily based on the amount of space available. And it's this type of flexibility, for me, which is really what responsive layouts are all about. Thank you for listening.